Well, good morning. I know that some of you are wondering, why in the world are you wearing a tie and a coat? I'm not setting a new trend. I have a funeral following this service. And I thought, well, I'll just dress one time. Then the other thing is, somebody asked me this morning, said, who's preaching today? I said, somebody famous. And then didn't tell them any different. So I'm sure they're disappointed right now. But anyways, getting out of the boat. You know, there's more than one way to get out of the boat. I have experienced it several different ways. And I have a couple of them that are funny, that whenever it's somebody else besides me. But some of you can maybe remember my friend Dan Ligg that passed away here not too long ago. We liked to fish together, and we was over in southern Missouri fishing. Got up that morning, and Dan said, well, you know, there's going to be scattered showers today. And I said, okay, let's just go ahead and try it out. So we got up and drove about 60 miles to the lake, got there. It was kind of cool that morning, and got in the boat, went all the way to the other side of the lake. And just as we got to the other side of the lake, we found where the scattered showers were. I mean, it began to rain, and the wind began to blow. And it rained so hard, and the wind blew so hard, that the rain was literally going sideways. And I had that little boat going just as hard as it could go to the other side of the lake to get out of it, but we couldn't have got any wetter if we'd have jumped in. And when we got to the other side, just before we get to the bank, Dan stood up, and something happened, and he went head first out of that boat. And when I looked at him the next time, he looked like a sea turtle, had his head stuck up above the water. And I just sat there and rolled. I mean, it was so funny. But there are several ways to get out of the boat. And this morning, I want us all to be able to get out of the boat. But let's do it in the manner that we know that the Lord is leading us. Some things that I've done in the past in getting out of the boat has not always been led of the Lord. I told this story once, but I was fishing and I was in my canoe. And I didn't have any place to tie my anchor, and I was catching fish right where I was at. So I tied the anchor around my leg, and I put it in. And if you've ever fished out of a canoe, they're a little wobbly. And I had a jigging pole, and that meant it was a long pole, and I pulled it up, and I had a fish on, and I went to catch it, and it went over here, and I lost my balance, and I put my arm out, or my hand out, to catch the side of the canoe, and I missed it. And when I did, I went upside down out in that water. When I came up, I had an anchor tied to my leg. The canoe went about as far as these front seats from me, and I went to go to it, and I couldn't go because I had an anchor tied on. Well, I stopped to try to untie it, and I'd go deeper and deeper, and I couldn't get it untied, and I'd come back up and get a breath, and I tried that a couple of times. So finally, that wasn't working. So I grabbed it and jerked it as hard as I could and moved it a little bit, and I finally caught up with the canoe. But I wasn't able to get back in the canoe. I was able to hoist the anchor up and put it in the canoe and work to the bank. But the canoe was about half full of water. And you get a canoe half full of water, you're not going to pick it up very easily. So as we get out of the boat today, I want you to turn, if you have your Bibles with you this morning, to Matthew, the 14th chapter. And I'm going to start reading down here in verse 22. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go over on ahead of him to the other side. While he dismissed the crowd, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the 4th hour of watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, came towards Jesus, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." And then immediately Jesus reached out and took him by the hand. You know, just in that same chapter, Jesus had just fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, when I'm here in Salem, usually 4 or 5 days a week, I fellowship and coffee with some other men, and I'm kind of the youngster of the bunch, and they are good about knowing Jesus. There are several men there from different denominations, and I know that you might say, "What?" Well, yes, you don't have to be a Nazarene to go to heaven. You just have to know Jesus. And we may not always agree, but we can disagree agreeably. But these men are a fine group of men. And I was thinking about these men that had got in this boat and going to the other side that Jesus had asked them to get in there and go. I got a feeling they was probably talking a little bit maybe about what had just taken place. You see, there had been a miracle taking place with the 5,000. That was 5,000 men and then the women and the children. And to take 5 loaves, 2 fish, and to feed everybody, and it said they were satisfied. It said that they were filled. And that is a miracle within itself. And that is the kind of group or the kind of people that I want to be around where miracles are taking place. How long has it been that you can say, I can point to a miracle that's taking place or has taken place? Now, whether you realize it or not, you're sitting in a miracle today. Right here is a miracle. Did you know that this building right here was built on $1,000? What? Yeah. When Tommy Shonahorse was killed and we had his funeral up in the old sanctuary, I was invited to come to be a part of that service. I wasn't pastoring here. Mike Ice was. But as I sat on the platform and I looked out and seen all them young people, I felt God spoke to my heart. We needed to have something like this to be able to help reach our young people. And without getting Pastor Mike's approval, I just stood up and said, we needed a gymnasium. And I'll pledge the first $1,000 towards it. Now, I didn't have $1,000. I had to go to the bank and borrow it, but I did. And then somebody else told me they pledged $1,000 and they didn't have it, so they had to go to the bank and they had to borrow it. But when I'm saying that a miracle took place, there was a lot of other people then to begin to put their thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, and you're sitting in a room today that's paid for, that started with just $1,000. Kind of reminds me of 5 loaves, 2 fish, and then see what happened. Now, we had an opportunity here a while back to listen to Pastor Kevin Donahoe come and speak to our men's group. And he spoke that day, and it spoke to my heart about how God can orchestrate and do things. And I felt like God orchestrated to be able to see this take place. And Pastor Kevin talked about he had an opportunity to go to a Cardinal baseball game. And if you know him, he is a real Cardinal fan. Now, he used to be. I don't know how things are going right now. Things have been a little tough. I think the Cardinals were snake bit. But anyways, as he began to speak, he told about a man in his church, this is where he's at, had some Cardinal tickets or tickets to the ball game that the Cardinals were playing in. And they called him up and said, these tickets are yours to have. You can take whoever you want. And he had previously had a man call him and said, I need to have a man come in and talk to you, and we need to make an appointment. And Pastor Kevin said, well, he made that appointment with that man, and he didn't know who he was, had never met him before, but he had this strange man that was going to come in and see him and didn't know what he was going to talk about. And he said it was on the very same day that he had Cardinal tickets. He said he thought, I don't know this guy. I don't know what he's going to talk about, but I've got these Cardinal tickets. But he said God wouldn't release him from his appointment that he had to do with that man. He said that man came in that day, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but before that man came in, he had been going to go on a flight and had another man take him to the airport. And he said to that man, he said, and this man had been a professor and had taught Psalms on the college level, and said, if you were going to win somebody to Jesus out of the book of Psalms, what would you choose? What verse? And Kevin already had it in his mind. He said, how about Psalms 51? And that's where the man had had his affair with that woman. And then the professor come back and said, well, why not Psalms 31? That would be a good one to use too. One of them was dealing with an affair. One of them was dealing with God's forgiveness. And Kevin had this man come in, and he'd been involved in an affair. And he shared Psalms 51 with him and had him read it. He said the man just literally broke down and began to sob and to cry. And he said, I hadn't went over and read Psalms 31, but he said, why don't now you read Psalms 31? And when he read Psalms 31, it dealt with the forgiveness of God. And Pastor Kevin said, you know what? I could not have orchestrated what took place. And there's a lot of things in life that if we'll look back upon it, we can see the handiwork of God within it to where it was orchestrated. Now, after I heard that sermon that Pastor Kevin preached on that, I got thinking about the things in my life that God had orchestrated. And one of them was I had answered my call to preach, and I knew I needed to prepare, and I had applied at Olivet Nazarene University to go to school. And after I'd applied, I got accepted, and I also had a job. Things looked like it was going to work out just fine. And the district superintendent of the district came along and had been out to Nazarene Bible College, and he came to our church on this particular Sunday, and he had talking about Nazarene Bible College was for men that were already older. I was 25 years old when I got saved, so I already had a family. And he began to talk about that. And during that service, God spoke to my heart. There wasn't no doubt about it. I had to go to Nazarene Bible College. I didn't have any money to pack my bags up and move to Nazarene Bible College. But you know how it worked out? My friend that I had went to grade school and high school with and had been friends had had an appointment to the Air Force Academy and was out going through the Air Force Academy, had met a couple, a businessman and his wife out there in Colorado, and he found out that I was going to go to Colorado Springs. He calls him up and said, I've got a friend of mine that's going to be moving out here. Now, I went into the bank and I said, I want to borrow $1,000. I said, God's called me to preach and I want to go to Nazarene Bible College in Colorado Springs, but I need some money. What'd you have for collateral? Nothing, just my word. And he loaned me $1,000 and he said, you sure that's enough? I said, sure is. He said, you have a job? I said, no. He said, do you have a place to live? I said, no. But I said, I'm going. I stepped out on faith. I got out of the boat and we packed up a U-Haul truck and moved to Colorado Springs with about a 3 or 4 year old little girl and one that was just a couple of months old in the back seat in a basket. And Kay followed me in a car and I drove a U-Haul truck and we moved to Colorado Springs. And my friend that Frank had got a hold of this businessman, his wife met me. And she said, I've got you an apartment to move into. So we moved into an apartment. She said, you got a job? I said, no. She said, you're going to have to go to work? I said, I am. She said, well, my husband has a candy company. And she said, he needs somebody to deliver candy. Do you want to go to work? I said, I sure do. The day that I got there, I had a job, I had a place to live, and things just began to fall into place. But I look back on that, God had to orchestrate all those things that fell into place. But for it to fall into place, I had to get out of the boat. Now, Jesus walked on the water. Now, I got a feeling those that were in the boat may have been talking a little bit about he just fed the 5,000. Wasn't that something? But then right after that, he has them get in the boat and start across the lake. And when they did, the winds began to blow. And the waves probably began to bounce that boat a little bit. And I don't know how many of them were seaworthy, but some of them may have even got a little bit sick. I've witnessed some of that. But as they was going across there, Jesus comes walking to them on the water. They had never seen anything like that. Do you know there's probably people in this church right here, right now, that came through something that was orchestrated that they'd never seen before. And I can't remember for sure, but I think it was called Hell's Fire and Heaven's Gates that came to this church. And revival began to happen. And people began to get out of the boat and make commitments to Jesus Christ. Now, I would like to see another revival come, but the only way revival will ever come is when we get out of the boat. Now, you'll have to pardon my way of putting this, but I like to put it to where I think you understand, and I understand because I'm simple, so I make it simple. This is kind of like an old gospel ship. And as this old gospel ship goes out to sea, and we're at sea, and whether you know it or not, we're at war. We're at war against sin and the things of this world that's taking people down. And we've got things that are taking place in our schools and in places right now and have been taking place that don't need to be taking place. And a lot of it is because the church doesn't get out of the boat. You know, if the church would get out of the boat and vote some of these things and make their voice heard, it would help change things in this old world. But we've got to get out of the boat. Now, I know we don't want to mess politics and that kind of stuff in here today, but you know what's right and you know what's wrong. And we need to do what's right by the Word of God and step out and get on the water. Now, when Jesus said, Peter, come on out here. They'd never seen anybody walk on the water before. In fact, they assumed that may be some kind of a ghost out there that's walking. But when Jesus spoke to them, they knew who he was. And Peter said, well, Lord, if it's really you, you tell me to come out on the water. Do you know what? I've thought of a lot of things that I've done before. If that's really you, but you step out by faith, and you know that you know that you know. Now, when he got out of that boat and stepped out on that water, do you know what he done? He started walking on the water. I can't imagine what that must have felt like if he looked around him. And can you imagine what was being said on the boat? Do you see Peter? He's walking on the water. But Peter got his eyes off of Jesus and got his eyes on the wind and the storm and the waves and the things that were taking place. And when he did, he began to sink. And those very same things happen to us today when we get our eyes off of Jesus. Now, I like that song that the band sang today, Living by Faith. Faith, living by faith, is what brings us above our trials and our heartaches. We're going to have heartaches and we're going to have trials. It rains on the just and the unjust. But by faith, we continue to walk with Jesus. And as Peter was out there, he hollered out, Jesus, save me. And that's what the old church needs to do, this old gospel ship. You see, this gospel ship is made up. Now, I'm thinking back in military terms. When I was aboard a ship, we had cooks. We had people that done the laundry. We had people that worked in the engine room. We had people that was on the bridge that done lookout watch. We had people that was on the engine order telegraph that operated the thing to tell the engineman down below what speed they wanted to go, or forwards or backwards. You had a man on the helm that had a course, and he took that course from the officer of the deck when he went on, and he knew what course they were supposed to be sailing. And all those different people made up different positions. And right here is what makes up. We've got people working in children's ministry this morning. That's helping the old gospel ship stay afloat. We've got people that whenever it comes time for a funeral that makes pies and cooks meals and things. And so we got cooks that does those things. And we've got all these different people doing different things. But yet we've got a whole boatload that's just sitting in the boat riding and haven't got out of the boat. It's time to get out of the boat. It's time for, if we're going to see something happen in this world today, and you know, since the COVID hit, the churches went down in numbers, and we've got a number of people that are sitting home watching it on television that could be here and being a part. But do you realize that where two or three are gathered together, Jesus said, I'm there too. He's here with us today. But he's speaking to our hearts. We've got to get out of the boat. Now, there's more than one way to get out of the boat, but I don't want to fall out of the boat. I want to get out of the boat on purpose. Now, just the other day, I happened to be out in my little two-man boat, and I came in, and I was getting out of the boat. And when I stepped out, I didn't step where I intended on stepping. And when I did, my daughter asked me, how come you're not wearing your old shoes? They're wet. Well, I didn't walk on the water, and I got my shoes wet. But we don't always step where we think we're going to step. But when we step where we don't think we ought to step, maybe spiritually, it's time to holler out to Jesus, Jesus, take me by the hand. And I'm living by faith. Faith realizes that underneath are the everlasting arms of God. Oh, we're going to make mistakes. And we're going to get our eyes off once in a while and maybe need to holler out to Jesus. But I want to tell you something. You holler out to Jesus, and his everlasting arms are there to pick us up and to bring us in and to put us on the right track and to make it happen. I pastored a church that when I went there, they was running probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 people. Their annual income was somewhere around $20,000. My salary was $75 a week. And I went there as a full-time pastor. And that church began to grow. Things began to happen. And excitement began to happen. And we started reaching new people, and new people started coming in. And it wasn't long until, we was running 40 and then 45 and then 50. And the old church was an old church. And every year when the floods came, one of the big highlights was how high the water got in the basement. Now, isn't that strange for a church to have a highlight of how high the water got in the basement? And as we went along, there was a lady in the church that some of the folks in the church that had been there for a long time didn't care for. And she would do some things. She was kind of odd. But she came to me one day and she said, Pastor, she said, we need to do something. We're getting crowded. We'd started running 75 and 80 and that number. And we're getting crowded. We need to do something. And she said, I've got a piece of property that's on a piece of the high ground in the community that the water doesn't flood. And she said, I would donate that to the church under one condition, that the church would build on that piece of property. You talk about a little fat guy that was happy. I mean, I was happy. And she said, on top of that, she said, I'll give $50,000. You talk about happy or happier. I was happier or happier. And I went to my church board about it because I thought, man, this is a winner. This is common sense. We're going to be able to have a new church. I was excited about it, reaching more people for Jesus. And one of the things, I was a young pastor, I didn't realize that to take that piece of property, we had to vote on it. And to take it under those conditions, the whole church body, which that's good, we had to vote on it. And we had a board meeting. And I had some on my board that was opposed to it. They wanted to stay right where they were at. They wanted to stay right there. They didn't want to have change. And back when they moved from the sanctuary to here, there was a little bit of that about moving. And so one lady that was a brand new Christian that got on the church board, there was a medical doctor in our community that built a brand new house just south of town. And it was a tremendous amount of money back then. It wouldn't be now today, but back then it was a lot of money. And some of them were speaking against doing this. We're going to have to go in debt and one thing and another, and didn't want to step out on faith. And she said, well, you know, it looks like to me that if one man can go down and build a big home for him and his family to live in, why couldn't all of us build a house to house the church? Made sense to me. Sounded good. But you know what happened? We had to announce it, and the day came for the vote that we were voting to accept the property and the $50,000. Being a young pastor, I didn't realize what was taking place, but some of their kids that hadn't been to church and who knows when showed up that day to vote, but they were members. They defeated that piece of property and that $50,000. They were elated that they had defeated it. Now, I'm talking about some of the old timers that were elated that defeated it. My district superintendent come along, and I had an architect in my church that had drawn up the church for us to build. I had the plans to build the church. And we were going to do it for a little over $100,000, and we already had $50-some thousand. And they voted that down. You talk about make your heart sink. My district superintendent come along and said, Doug, he said, I've got a church that's wanting to build that needs a pastor. And he said, I'd like for you to go and talk to them. I did. They called me. I went. And you know, we built a brand new church out of those plans and only borrowed $120,000. And they paid it off, but they grew. The church that voted it no, they fell out of the boat. And within 6 years, they closed the doors on that church. You know why they closed the doors on it? It's because people that sat in the pews didn't listen to God. And they wouldn't get out of the boat. They thought $100,000-some would sink them for sure. Well, I want to tell you something. I'm thankful that you had a pastor and a church board that could see what could happen here today, and here's what happened. We're here. But you know what? We're at the place that we need a revival. We're at the place that we need to get out of the boat. We're at a place that we need to get into it. Because once you start dwindling, it's easy for it to keep on going, because when you dwindle, you begin to grumble. And when you begin to grumble, you lose faith in the Almighty God that's guiding and directing and trying to bring you along. Now, I haven't heard of anybody yet that's really grumbling bad enough that they're going to be a Cub fan. But you know what? It just takes a little bit. And I've used this for illustration before. But you know, you take a barn lot full of pigs, and one pig start biting on another pig's tail, and the other pigs will begin to bite on that tail. And it's not long, they'll kill that one pig. And around the church, if they start picking on the pastor, or picking at this and picking at that, it's not long we just got a bunch of pickers and we're not doing anything but destroying the kingdom. We got to get out of the boat. Now, if you don't know Jesus Christ as your Savior this morning, He's here. And He'd be glad to meet you at this altar and come in your life and change your life where you'd think, I'm walking on the water. You're walking by faith. I'm walking by faith. I'm walking by faith today. I stepped out on retirement in faith. I went into ministry on faith. But I'll tell you what, I'm still walking on the water. I'd like for Jeremy to come at this time. If you're a little bit nervous about it, who's going to be there to catch you? Jesus. I'd rather be doing what Jesus wanted me to do as anything else in the whole wide world. I want to go where he wants me to go. And I want to tell you one more little story. I'm good about telling stories. But I had a couple in my church, and they had one daughter. And on one particular Sunday, that one daughter stepped out and come to the altar and knelt down at that altar and made the announcement that God had called her to the mission field. Her mommy and daddy come down behind her, put their arms around her, and said, "You're all that we have. Don't go to the mission field," and cried and begged her not to go. And she turned around from that altar and listened to mommy and daddy instead of being obedient and getting out of the boat. But you know what was sad? She also dropped out of church. And you know what else was sad? She wouldn't even let the preacher come in the house when he'd come and knock on her door. She hardened her heart. Folks, when God speaks to us to get out of the boat, I don't know where you're at today spiritually, but I know one thing. If God's speaking to your heart this morning to get out of the boat, you're welcome to come down here and pray at this altar. I'd like for you to stand with me.
He safely will carry me through, no matter what evils betide. Why should I then care though the tempest may blow, if Jesus walks close to my side? Living by faith in Jesus above, trusting, confiding in his great love. I'm safe from all harm in his sheltering arms. I'm living by faith and feel no other.